Welcome back. All right, so in the first part we talked about how to find a salvaged engine at a self-service salvage yard, and at this point we are satisfied that we have a good engine and we are bringing it back to home so that we can check it more thoroughly and before installing ensure that this engine is going to be ready to plug and play. So a real quick note, one of the other things that I forgot to mention in the previous video, when I lived in St. Louis, I used to use a full-service salvage yard for a lot of this. They were really inexpensive. An engine like this would have been $350. It would have already been tested. They guarantee it. You can bring it back within a month if you have any problems. I think that place was called Owl's Salvage or Owl's Foreign Auto or something like that. And those yards I've never got a bad part from any of those yards. I've never been burned on an engine at a self-service yard, but I have on a transmission once. No way to test a transmission other than pull the pan and look for metal parts, I guess. But so far in the previous video, we're pretty satisfied that we've got a winner here. So now we're going to thoroughly check it. A couple of tricks that I like to do to check this. On some models, what I can do is if the starter bolts up to the engine block as opposed to the transmission, for example, the GM 4.3 liter Vortec engines, I know you can do this trick with, and then hook up a battery to your starter, and you can actually do a compression test very easily by just engaging the starter with the flywheel in the engine, and you can do a compression test. And that's one of the things that I prefer to do. I, again, really believe in and like compression tests. We're not going to be able to do that on this model. In most models, you cannot do that. So the next best thing is actually a better test anyway, and that is a leak-down test. And that is exactly what I'm going to do on this engine, although I do leak-down tests a little bit differently. Now, one of the things, most of you guys are familiar with the compression test. The difference with a leak down and a compression test pretty much for all practical purposes will tell you whether or not you have compression in a cylinder. If you don't, it really doesn't do a good job of telling you why. Obviously, one of the tricks, if you add oil to the cylinder and you get much better compression, then you can assume that there's a really good chance the rings are at fault. But in general, with just the compression tester alone, you really don't have a good way of telling where the compression loss is. Is it through the head? Is it through a valve? You really can't tell. With this, it not only tells you if there's compression loss, but it tells you where the compression loss is going. So this can be hugely helpful. You'll know if you've got a really serious problem. You can certainly tell whether it's something you'll have to remove the head for or whether it's a bottom end issue. So I really prefer the leak down test. Obviously, probably can't do a leak down test at Pick and Pull, but we can do one here. So let's go ahead and do a leak down test on this engine, and I'll show you that I do mine a little differently than those of you who know how to do this. First step, I'm going to try to find, I was already at it. I'm going to try to find the compression stroke on my first cylinder, so I'm going to turn over until I feel air push out of the spark plug hole, and there it is. And then to find top dead center, on this model I'm going to actually use, I usually use a straw, but these have really deep spark plug tubes, so I'm going to use this special tool to help find top dead center. You could easily use a long screwdriver or something as well. And this little tool here has a little indicator that moves up, and we'll be able to find the highest point. And I just passed it. Right there. Okay, so there's top dead center compression stroke. Now I can remove this and put in my leak down gauge. So I'm going to hook my gauge up to compressed air and zero it out. And it is already zeroed out, so we're good to go. We're looking over here. This is my input air pressure, and we want to get right in the middle of the set. All right, so now when I hook it up to this cylinder, the most important thing that we want to do here before I hook this up, you do not want that ratchet on your crankshaft bolt, because the idea is this is going to put compressed air, and because we're at top dead center, the cylinder is going to stay, the piston is going to stay in position if it's perfectly at top dead center. If it is not, and this is going to push the piston down awful hard, it's going to fling that ratchet off, and it's going to hurt somebody or do some severe damage. So we want to make sure that you got that ratchet off. And ideally, if I set it to top dead center right, this is going to hold. All right, let's see if we can keep this in view this time. Okay, there we go. And we can see that we are in the low range, so this is good. We've got very low leak down. That means we not only have good compression in the cylinder, but also we're not losing it anywhere. I can hear a little bit, and it sounds like it's coming out the exhaust, actually. Yeah, so there's a little bit of leak past the exhaust. So that's the nice thing about this gauge. If you hear the air coming out of the exhaust manifold, then you are leaking past the exhaust valve. If you hear the air coming through the intake manifold or at the throttle body, then you have an intake valve leak. If you hear it at the oil pan, then you have a ring leakage. And some leak down, especially on an engine like this one with, I think it was like 138,000 miles, this is perfectly acceptable. Your other option, of course, is also to have leak past a gasket or a crack in the cylinder wall, and that would go into the coolant generally. So you can also listen at your coolant values. If you ever have any leakage at all in the coolant, then it doesn't matter whether it's low or not. That's a bad engine. But I definitely hear a little through the exhaust valve. I'm not worried about that at all. So we've got a good leak down test on this cylinder. I'm going to repeat this, of course, on the other 3 cylinders. And if all the leak downs are good, then we've got some good indication. But I do my leak down test a little differently, and I will explain why. All right, what you just saw is, of course, the traditional leak down test. And you guys are probably wondering, hey, you said you were going to do something different. That's how everybody does it. But the thing is, and this is more my opinion, I don't like doing the test that way very much, and that's because the piston is at the very top of the cylinder. So all you're doing is you're just testing leak down only in that combustion area. And the problem is, what if you have a crack in the cylinder wall or something that is behind the piston? Well, you're not going to detect that. So what I actually like to do is do my leak down test so that the piston is on the bottom of the compression stroke, so that I'm actually filling the whole cylinder and combustion chamber with air. And that way, if there's any leak because of a cylinder wall crack, that would not have been detected if the piston passed that area. Now I can detect it, and you of course would hear that through the coolant passages and have some leak down. So I think this is a more thorough way. I hope that makes sense to you, but I think that's a more thorough way of doing the leak down test, because you're testing the whole cylinder, not just the very top of the combustion chamber. The other thing too is, why not just only do that? Well, the reason I like to do the top dead center as well is because it also helps me to test that the timing is correct on the engine. If I do the whole cylinder first, the bottom of the compression stroke, and test the whole cylinder with the leak down test, then I know that that cylinder is solid. I know that that's good. There's no problem. But it also doesn't tell me that the timing is good. If I then do the top dead center and find I have massive leak through either the intake or exhaust, well, those valves should be totally closed at top dead center. And I know then that my camshaft and crankshaft aren't aligned in time properly. So I like to do both tests because it kind of helps to assess that. I don't know if I explained that very well, but it certainly makes sense to me, at least. All right, for this test, it doesn't matter where the piston is. Again, just don't have your ratchet in when you connect this. All right, so you can see now that I've got really high leakage, and that's because I'm not at top dead center, and I can actually feel the air coming out all the way out of the exhaust valve. So we're on the exhaust stroke here, and that's fine. It doesn't matter where you're at, just as long, again, as you don't have the ratchet connected while you connect this thing. What I'm going to do now is rotate the engine until I get compression, and you can hear now we've changed the sound a little bit because the intake valve is now open. So I should be nearing my compression stroke then. All right, now here I am. So right now what's happening is I'm just at the bottom of the compression stroke, because if I push any further, you see the gauge starts moving. And you see it moves a little slower here, and that's because it takes a second, stay still there, it takes a second for it to fill all the way up with air. But you can see that it's the same reading as before, so I know that there are no cracks in the cylinder wall the whole way up the cylinder. And I can continue to push down and see if I can get a little better compression there, but this is perfectly acceptable to me. I know that the entire cylinder now passes this test. So I'm going to slowly lit up on the ratchet, and again, I'm going to do both tests on all the cylinders to ensure that not only the cylinders are in good order, but also that the valves are completely closed at top dead center like they should be. All right, so I did do the leak down test, of course, on all cylinders. They were all exactly the same, well in the low range. So that pretty much settles it. There's no question that this engine would run. But there's one last thing that I like to do. Actually, there's a lot of things that I like to do, but I'm not going to do them on this engine. Normally, I do things like measure the lobe lift and things like that to make sure that the camshaft isn't worn and stuff, which I don't think is an issue anyway here. But I do want to do one last test, and that is I do want to look at the rod bearings on the engine and measure them, because that gives me a really good indication on whether this engine is going to last another 5,000 miles or whether it could last another 50, maybe 100,000 miles. And I always like to examine the bearings and measure the clearance, even if I'm not going to do an engine rebuild or something like that. So that's going to be the final test for this engine. So let's go ahead and do that. And if that passes okay, we're going to go ahead and plug this thing right into the car as it is. All right, and I'm going to do just one real quick, easy check on a clearance thing. And I can already tell by feel that, you remember earlier I was checking this for this play here side to side. That's actually called the thrust clearance. And I can just tell by feel that that's definitely within spec. But if you don't have that feel, you'll probably want to measure it. So I've got the thrust clearance tolerances mapped out here. We're looking for 0.0059 inches to 0.0098 inches. So that means this feeler gauge at 0.006 should easily fit in the gap that's created. So I'm going to pull this to one side. This should easily fit in the gap, and it very easily fits in that gap. And then this gauge should barely fit in the gap. It should have some drag, and it does. It has a little tug to it. So we know that that is within spec. That'll ensure the engine runs quiet, and it just makes me feel a little more confident about this engine, because every time I check something, it just shines brighter and brighter. So this is a really good sign. Obviously, I'll check those clearances the rest of the way on the other connecting rods as well, just to be safe. But that's another easy check you can do as long as you're in here. I am back at the bottom of the engine, and what we're going to do is check the bearings. One of the most important things, though, when you remove these caps, they are absolutely directional as well as specific to that cylinder. So I'm actually going to use a little punch here, and I'm going to mark the top part and the bottom part so that I know, because I'm going to ultimately take several of these off. I usually don't do these one at a time because I get all the ones that are available, and then I'll turn the crank and get the other two. But we don't want to mix these up, and we also don't want to change the orientation by accident. They have to go exactly the way that they started. That's very important. So I just made a little punch marks using a number punch so that I cannot possibly make a mistake putting this back together. What I'm going to do now is loosen up these nuts here for the rod cap just a little bit at a time. I'm very particular about that with this part of the engine. I like to loosen things up just a quarter of a turn at a time, and I never use any impact tools or air tools or anything like that at this stage. I'm a little bit particular about that. So let's go ahead and get a ratchet and get this thing off of here.